Okay, let's get into it. Number 12. Gemini 9's Spacewalk from Hell. Picture this. You are outside your spacecraft, 160 miles above the Earth, and you can't see anything. Not because the lights are off, because the inside of your own visor has fogged over, and then, when you drifted into the planet's shadow, that fog froze. A thin sheet of ice on the one piece of glass between your eyes and the rest of the universe. You are, functionally, blind. And you are exhausted in a way you did not know a human body could be exhausted. That was June 5th, 1966. The astronaut was Gene Cernan, who would later become the last man to walk on the moon. But on this day, he was just the second American ever to open a hatch and float out into open space. And he was finding out, in real time, that nobody had any idea how hard this actually was. Here's the thing they didn't understand yet. In space, there is nothing to push against. On Earth, if you want to turn a bolt, you brace your feet, you plant your other hand, and you turn. Cernan had none of that. No handholds where he needed them, no foot restraints. Every single time he tried to do anything, his whole body just rotated the other way. He described it like trying to fix a car while wearing ice skates on a sheet of ice, with the car floating. The plan was for him to climb to the back of the spacecraft and strap into a jet-powered backpack, a maneuvering unit, and go flying free. But just getting back there wore him down to nothing. His heart rate climbed to about 155 beats per minute. That's what your heart does when you sprint up 120 stairs a minute. He was doing that, for a long time, inside a suit that could not carry away the heat his body was dumping into it. So he cooked. The sweat poured off him, fogged the visor, and there was nothing he could do about it except press his nose against the glass and try to rub a little clear patch to peer through. Down on the ground, the flight surgeon was listening to his breathing get heavier and heavier and quietly starting to worry that he might pass out. And if you pass out during a spacewalk in 1966, there is no one coming to get you. Your crewmate cannot leave the cabin to save you. They scrapped the backpack test. They just wanted him back inside, alive, and getting a blind, overheated, worn-out man back through a hatch built for someone calm and rested was its own small nightmare. He made it. He lost a few pounds in sweat in a single afternoon. And that's the part that should stay with you. What nearly killed Gene Cernan wasn't a broken machine. Nothing malfunctioned. It was just physics that nobody had accounted for yet. The simple, brutal fact that a human being with nothing to hold on to is a helpless thing. Space didn't attack him. It just let him tire himself out until he couldn't see. And it watched. Number 11. Liberty Bell 7 and Gus Grissom's near drowning. Gus Grissom flew to the edge of space and back on July 21st, 1961. And the most dangerous moment of his day came after he'd already landed. That's the cruel joke of it. The rocket worked, the capsule worked, the parachute worked. He splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean, safe, floating, 15 minutes of American spaceflight behind him. And then the ocean nearly took him. His capsule was called Liberty Bell 7. It bobbed in the swells while a Marine helicopter moved in to hook it and lift it out. The plan was simple. Hook the capsule, lift it a little, Grissom blows the hatch on his own signal, climbs out, slips into a sling, gets winched up. Routine. Except the hatch blew early. On its own. Grissom was lying there, running through his checklist, and the explosive bolts on the hatch just fired. The hatch flew off, and the Atlantic came pouring in over the sill. Now everything happens fast. Water floods the capsule. Grissom scrambles out into the open sea. And here's what he doesn't realize in the chaos. There's an oxygen inlet on his suit that he left open, and water is getting in, and his suit is slowly turning from a life-saving thing into a weight belt. He's swimming, and he's sinking at the same time. The waves are pushing him around, and the helicopter crew, the ones who were supposed to save him, are staring at a horrible choice because their cable is hooked to a capsule that is now completely full of seawater and getting heavier every second. The capsule wins that fight. It's too heavy. The helicopter is being dragged down toward the water itself, engine straining, and finally they have to cut it loose. Liberty Bell 7 sinks. It goes down nearly 3 miles to the floor of the Atlantic, where it will sit in the dark for 38 years before anyone brings it back up. And Grissom is still in the water, still sinking until a second helicopter finally gets a sling to him and hauls him out. He lived. But here's the detail that turns this from a scary story into something sadder. Almost immediately, the whispers started. That Grissom had panicked, that he'd hit the hatch himself and blown it early, that he'd lost his nerve and nearly lost the capsule because of it. That story followed him for the rest of his life. He always said the same thing. I was just lying there, and it just blew. He never got to see himself cleared, because he died in the Apollo-1 fire 6 years later. It took new analysis, decades on, to say plainly what he'd said all along. It wasn't his fault. The hatch fired on its own. He survived the ocean. It was the story about him that he couldn't outswim. Number 10. Friendship. Seven and John Glenn's heat shield warning. There is a specific kind of fear that comes from knowing something is wrong, but not being told what. John Glenn spent part of his reentry inside that fear, and the people who put him there were the people on the ground who were supposed to be keeping him safe. February 20th, 1962. Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth, going around 3 times in a little capsule called Friendship 7. It's a triumph, broadcast to a whole nervous nation. And then, partway through, an engineer at a console named William Saunders notices something ugly in the telemetry. A reading labeled Segment 51. And what Segment 51 is telling him is that the heat shield on Glenn's capsule, the shield that stands between Glenn and roughly 3,000 degrees of reentry fire, might no longer be locked in place. If that reading is true, Glenn is going to burn up. It's that simple. The heat shield is the whole game. Lose it, and the capsule and the man inside come apart in the upper atmosphere as a streak of light. So Mission Control has a problem, and notice how they handle it. They don't immediately tell Glenn, the shield might be loose, brace yourself. Instead, they start asking him strange, oblique questions. A tracking station in Hawaii asks him to flip the landing bag deploy switch to a certain position, and Glenn, who is a test pilot and not a fool, reads between the lines instantly. You don't ask me about the landing bag for no reason. Something is wrong with my heat shield, and nobody is saying it out loud. Meanwhile, the controllers are arguing among themselves. Normally, after the retro rockets fire to slow you down, you jettison the empty retro pack. You drop it, it's dead weight. But the retro pack is strapped over the heat shield, so somebody has the idea. What if we don't drop it? What if we keep the retro pack clamped on, and it holds the shield in place long enough to get through the fire? It's a gamble either way. They decide to keep it on, which means John Glenn re-enters the atmosphere with a retro pack still bolted to his heat shield. And as the fire builds up outside, that retro pack starts to burn and break apart. And Glenn is looking out his window, watching great flaming chunks of something fly past. And he cannot tell. He genuinely cannot tell. Whether he's watching the retro pack burn away like it's supposed to, or whether he's watching his own heat shield disintegrate in front of him. He says it out loud on the radio. That's a real fireball outside. He made it. And here's the twist that makes the whole thing almost unbearable in hindsight. The heat shield was fine. It had never been loose. Segment 51 was a faulty switch, a bad sensor, a lie told by a broken wire. Glenn rode through that fire, watching debris and wondering if he was about to die, Because of a false alarm, nobody was willing to fully explain to him while it was happening. Number 9. The Soyuz MS-10 launch abort. It's easy to file all of this under history. Old capsules, grainy footage, men with crew cuts in 1960-something. So let's jump forward. October 11th, 2018. This one was on camera. This one had a live feed. 2 men strapped into a Soyuz on top of a rocket at Baikonur in Kazakhstan. Nick Hague, a NASA astronaut on his very first flight. Alexei Ovchinin, a Russian cosmonaut on his second. Their destination is the International Space Station. The launch looks perfect. The rocket climbs, the sky goes from blue to black, everything is nominal. And then, about 2 minutes up, right at the moment the 4 strap-on boosters are supposed to fall away, something goes wrong. One of the boosters doesn't push off cleanly. Instead, it swings in and hits the core of the rocket, and it ruptures a fuel tank. In an instant, the vehicle underneath these 2 men stops being a rocket and starts being a problem that is going to kill them unless the escape system works right now. It works. The abort fires, and the capsule with Hague and Ovchinin is yanked up and away from the failing rocket, and then it comes back down the hard way. A ballistic descent, steep and fast and crushing. They pull heavy Gs. They land in the emptiness of Kazakhstan, hundreds of miles from the pad, and when the rescue crews reach them, they climb out. Healthy, alive, rattled, but fine. Now here's the detail that keeps me up. They spent months investigating what went wrong, tearing into this rocket that had flown flawlessly for decades. And what they found at the bottom of all of it was a single sensor pin. 1 pin, bent by a few degrees during assembly. That's it. That's the whole catastrophe. A tiny mechanical part put in slightly crooked by human hands on the ground, years before, waiting quietly through the countdown for the one moment it could ruin everything. 2 people nearly died 2 minutes into a flight because of a bent pin. And the only reason they didn't is that someone, decades earlier, insisted that every crewed rocket carry a system whose entire job is to save the crew when the rocket itself decides to fail. Riding a rocket is still, in 2018 in this century, a coin that gets flipped. Most times it lands right. That day it didn't, and the only thing between 2 men and the ground was a tower of escape motors doing exactly what it was built to do in the half second it had to do it. Number 8. STS-9, Columbia's landing fires. Here's how it looked from the outside. December 1983. The Space Shuttle Columbia glides down out of the sky after 10 days in orbit, touches down smoothly at Edwards Air Force Base in the California desert, rolls to a stop. A clean landing. A successful mission. The crew walks away. Nothing to see. Here's what was actually happening inside that clean landing. A few hours before reentry, while the crew was getting the orbiter turned around and pointed the right way, they fired the small thrusters that nudged the ship's attitude. And one of the flight computers, the machines that literally fly the vehicle, crashed. Just died. A few minutes later, a second computer crashed the same way. Now, the shuttle carried backups precisely for this reason. Layers of redundancy. But the commander, John Young, one of the most experienced astronauts who ever lived, a man who had walked on the moon, did something telling. He delayed the landing. He let the orbiter just drift for a while, because he did not trust what was happening, and he wanted to understand it before committing to the one part of the flight you cannot pause, the fall through the atmosphere. They found out later what caused it. When those thrusters fired, the jolt knocked a tiny piece of solder loose inside the machine, and that loose fleck shorted out a circuit board. A crumb of metal. That's what took down the computers. And then, as if that weren't enough, as the orbiter came in for landing, a hydrazine leak set 2 of the ship's 3 auxiliary power units on fire. 2 of 3. The units that drive the hydraulics, the things that move the flight controls, and the landing gear. They caught fire. The fire burned itself out, chewing up the compartment, and the crew landed, not knowing it had even happened. So picture that clean, smooth, nothing to see landing again. 2 dead computers a few hours earlier, 2 of 3 power units burning on final approach, and a public that saw a triumph. John Young said something afterward that I can't shake. He testified that if they had switched over to the backup flight software at that particular moment during the computer trouble, they would have lost the vehicle and the crew. Loss of vehicle and crew. He said it plainly. The margin between the smiling crew walking across the tarmac and a smoking hole in the desert was a single decision he happened to get right. About software, made under pressure, hours before anyone on the ground had any idea how close it had been. And most people watching never knew there was anything to know. Number 7. Apollo-Soyuz and the poison gas. This is the one where the danger has no sound, no fire, no drama you can point a camera at. Just a smell, and then nothing. July 1975. The Apollo-Soyuz test project. If you don't know it, it's one of the great symbolic moments of the whole space age. An American Apollo capsule and a Soviet Soyuz docking together in orbit. 2 astronauts and 2 cosmonauts shaking hands through the hatch. The 2 superpowers that had spent 2 decades trying to out-rocket each other suddenly, gently, cooperating. A handshake in space. It's beautiful. It was also the last flight of an Apollo command module, the end of an era, and it almost ended with 3 dead Americans in the final minutes. Here's what happened. On the way down, during the parachute descent, the crew, Tom Stafford, Vance Brand, and Deke Slayton, needed to throw a series of switches to manage the spacecraft's systems. A couple of those switches didn't get thrown at the right time. And because of that, the thruster system's fuel, a substance called nitrogen tetroxide, which is a nasty, corrosive, toxic oxidizer, vented outside the capsule and then got pulled right back in through the cabin's air intake as they opened up to the outside atmosphere. So now the 3 of them are breathing poison. In a sealed cabin, descending under parachutes, with a yellowish acrid gas filling the air they have to breathe. It burns the lungs. Vance Brand passed out, just lost consciousness, right there in his seat. Stafford managed to get oxygen masks onto the crew, and that's very likely what saved their lives. They splashed down. And then all 3 of them went to the hospital for about 2 weeks with chemical pneumonia and fluid in their lungs. 2 weeks. From breathing rocket propellant on the way home. They all recovered. Fully. But it was that close. And think about the shape of this. Not a rocket blowing up. Not a heat shield failing. Not the vacuum of space. The crew that had just symbolically ended the space race, that had performed the great feel-good moment of the entire Cold War, nearly died in the last few minutes of the last Apollo flight because of a couple of switches in the wrong position. No enemy. No grand cosmic force. Just a checklist. And a quiet, invisible gas. And a man slumping, unconscious, while his spacecraft drifted down toward the ocean under 3 good parachutes. Number 6. Salyut 7, the dead station. Let's change the temperature, literally. Everything so far has been fire and speed and things going too fast. This one is cold, and slow, and quiet, and honestly it's the closest thing the real space program has to a ghost story. In February 1985, the Soviet space station Salyut 7 was orbiting empty, with no crew aboard, waiting for its next visitors. And then it stopped answering. An electrical fault killed its radios and drained its batteries, and just like that, 20 tons of space station went dark and silent. No power, no heat, no voice. It began to slowly tumble, drifting around its orbit, dead. And inside, without heat, it started to freeze. Frost crept across the walls. Ice formed on the windows from the inside. The whole station became a frozen tomb, tumbling in the dark, roughly the temperature of a deep freezer, unable to talk to anyone and unable to hold itself steady. Now here is the part that sounds like science fiction. The Soviets decided to try to save it. And to save it, 2 cosmonauts, Vladimir Janibekov and Viktor Savinik, had to fly up in a Soyuz and dock with it, by hand. Understand what that means. Normally when you dock with a station, the station is cooperating. It's holding still. It's talking to you. Its radar is helping you line up. Salyut 7 could do none of that. It was tumbling, and it was mute. So Janibekov had to fly a manual approach to a target that would not talk back, judging distance by eye, and with a handheld laser rangefinder, matching the slow rotation of a dead 20-ton object, and easing his ship into the docking port without any of the help you'd normally rely on. People have studied that piece of piloting for decades. It's considered one of the hardest things anyone has ever done in orbit. And then they went inside. Into the dark, into the cold. They wore fur hats and heavy winter coats. Inside a spacecraft. Their breath fogged in the air. They moved through the frozen station by flashlight, beams cutting through the gloom, ice glittering on every surface. And piece by piece, in the freezing dark, they brought it back. They turned the whole station to face the sun so the solar panels could catch light. They coaxed the batteries back into charging. They thawed it out and rewired what had died, and slowly, the dead station warmed up and woke up and started to breathe again. 2 men, alone, resurrecting a frozen corpse of a machine with flashlights in their bare hands. And it worked. Salyut 7 flew again. But I think about those first hours inside. The silence, the frost, the 2 little cones of flashlight in an enormous dead thing that used to be full of people. Space doesn't only kill with fire. Sometimes it just goes quiet and cold and waits to see if you're brave enough to come inside. Number 5. Soyuz T-10-1 and the exploding pad. Some of these emergencies unfold over minutes. This one is measured in seconds, and the margin at the end of it is about 2 of them. September 26th, 1983. Baikonur again. 2 cosmonauts, Vladimir Titov and Gennady Strekalov, are strapped into a Soyuz on top of a fully fueled rocket, going through the final countdown to launch. Everything is normal. And then, about 90 seconds before liftoff, down at the base of the rocket, a valve fails. Fuel starts spilling, and it catches fire. Now, a fire at the base of a fueled rocket on the pad is one of the worst things that can happen in this entire business. Because what you have underneath these 2 men is essentially a bomb that is now on fire and about to go off. Every second counts. And here's the truly frightening part. The fire was burning through the cables of the automatic abort system. The very system whose whole job was to sense exactly this kind of emergency and pull the crew to safety. It was being disabled by the thing it was supposed to save them from. So it came down to people. 2 controllers on the ground, watching this fire spread, had to make the call and send the abort command manually, by radio, at the same time, on a coordinated signal. And they did. The launch escape system, that tower of solid rocket motors on the very top of the stack, lit up and tore the crew capsule straight up and off the burning rocket. 2 seconds later, the rocket exploded. 2 seconds. The escape tower hauled Titov and Strekalov up and away, pulling them at brutal G-forces, and behind them and below them, the whole thing erupted into a fireball that consumed the pad. The capsule arced up, came down under parachutes a couple of miles away, and the 2 men inside, bruised, shaken, no doubt with their hearts absolutely pounding, survived. There's a story that the crew were heard cursing over the radio as the tower fired, and honestly, if there was ever a moment that earned it, that was it. This is the only time in the entire history of human spaceflight that a launch escape system has fired with a crew aboard and saved them from a rocket exploding on the pad. The only time. And it worked because 2 people on the ground kept their heads while a bomb caught fire under 2 of their friends and pressed the button with about a 2-second margin between rescue and a funeral. Machines are wonderful, but that night, it was human nerve that did it. Number 4. Peggy, Whitson, and Soyuz TMA-11's ballistic reentry. We are going to come back to a recurring nightmare in this business, because it keeps happening, and that's exactly what makes it frightening. The dream where the spacecraft won't let go of the piece it's supposed to drop. April 19th, 28. A Soyuz capsule undocks from the International Space Station and heads home. On board are 3 people: the cosmonaut Yuri Malenchenko, South Korea's first astronaut Yi So-yeon, and the American Peggy Whitson, who is coming home after commanding the entire station. Routine trip. Fire the engines to slow down, fall out of orbit, 3 modules of the Soyuz separate, and the little crew capsule rides its heat shield down to the step. Except one of the modules doesn't separate. There's a service module at the back, and it's held on by pyrotechnic bolts, and one of those bolts fails to fire. So the service module stays attached, and with that dead weight hanging off the back, the whole spacecraft flips to find its stable position, which puts the capsule re-entering nose first. The forward hatch, not the heat shield, is now leading the way into the fire. Inside, the crew starts to feel it go wrong. The ride gets violent. The capsule is fighting itself, and it drops into what's called a ballistic reentry. A steep, unguided plunge that trades a survivable, gentle descent for a brutal one. They pulled over 8 Gs, 8 times their body weight pressing them into their seats, and there was smoke in the cabin, because the wrong end of the spacecraft was burning. Then the physics saved them, the same way it had once saved a cosmonaut nearly 40 years earlier. The connections to the stuck service module melted through in the heat. It finally fell away, and the freed capsule swung itself around the right way, heat shield forward, and rode the rest of the way down properly. They landed hard, about 300 miles from where they were supposed to, in the middle of nowhere, with the grass around the scorched capsule catching fire. And they lived. Here's the detail that turns this from a scary landing into something worse. This was not a freak, 1 in a million event. The Soyuz right before this one, the previous flight, had suffered the same kind of separation failure and the same kind of violent ballistic reentry. 2 in a row. The same fault, twice, on the vehicle that is the workhorse of human spaceflight, the one that has carried more people to orbit than anything else ever built. Not a fluke. A pattern. And a pattern is so much more frightening than an accident, because a fluke is over the moment it ends, and a pattern is still out there, waiting for the next crew. Number 3. STS-27, Atlantis, the classified near Columbia. This is the one that should have been a warning. This is the one where the disaster of 2003 happened first, 15 years early, and everyone survived. And somehow the lesson didn't take. If you want a story that will genuinely unsettle you, it's this one, because it's not about what went wrong in the sky. It's about what people on the ground chose to believe. December 2nd, 1988. This is only the second space shuttle flight after the Challenger disaster, so the whole program is supposed to be walking on eggshells about safety. Atlantis lifts off on a classified mission for the Department of Defense. A secret military flight, which matters, so hold on to that. About 85 seconds into launch, a piece of insulating material breaks off one of the solid rocket boosters and slams into the belly of the orbiter, into the thermal protection tiles. The tiles that keep the ship from burning up on the way home. The crew doesn't know how bad it is yet, but once they're in orbit, they use the robot arms camera to look at the underside of their own spacecraft. And what they see stops their hearts. White streaks all across the belly. Damage everywhere. It looks, to the commander, Hoot Gibson, a very experienced astronaut, like the ship has been shot up. He later said he was convinced they were looking at a catastrophe. He thought they were probably going to die on reentry. So they send the imagery down to the ground. And this is where the secret mission part bites. Because it's a classified flight, the video is downlinked through an encrypted channel, at low resolution, degraded. And the people on the ground look at this murky footage and conclude that it's not that bad, that it's probably just lighting or minor dings, and they essentially wave off the crew's alarm. The ground, as Gibson put it, wasn't seeing what the crew was seeing. Imagine that. You are in orbit. You have looked at your own ship with your own eyes and your own camera, and you believe you're going to burn to death coming home. And the people whose job it is to help you are telling you to relax, because the picture on their end is too blurry to show them the truth. Gibson decided that if they were going to die, they weren't going to spend 3 days terrified about it. He told his crew, roughly, there's no reason to die, all tensed up. So they spent the rest of the mission looking out the windows at the Earth, trying not to think about the fire they were fairly sure was waiting for them. Then, they came home. And during reentry, the plasma, the superheated gas of reentry, found the worst of the damage. It burned through a steel plate under a missing tile and actually started to eat into the aluminum skin of the orbiter. It was breaching the ship. But, and this is almost too lucky to believe, the single tile that had come completely off happened to be sitting right over a spot where the metal underneath was thicker than average, because there was an antenna mounted there. That one patch of slightly thicker metal held just long enough. Atlantis passed through the hottest part of re-entry before the skin gave way, and cooled down, and landed. 700 damaged tiles. One gone entirely. The crew climbs out and finally sees the belly of their ship, and it's a horror show. They had been right the whole time. They had looked death in the face and been told it was a trick of the light. 15 years later, debris hit a wing. The ground decided it probably wasn't serious, and 7 people didn't come home. STS-27 was the rehearsal, and nobody wanted to admit they'd already seen the show. Number 2. Boris Volynov and Soyuz 5's nose-first re-entry. If you want to know how much a human body and a human will can survive, you have to know the name Boris Volynov, and you have to know what happened to him on January 18th, 1969, alone on the way down. Volynov is coming home in Soyuz 5. He fires the retro rockets to drop out of orbit, and then the same monster we just met comes back. The service module, the big chunk at the back, does not separate. It stays bolted on. And just like on that later flight, the combined spacecraft rotates to find its stable position, and the stable position is exactly the wrong one. The heavy crew capsule swings around so that its light metal entry hatch is facing forward into the re-entry fire, and the heat shield, the good, strong, thick heat shield that is supposed to take the heat, is pointed the wrong way, backward. So Boris Volynov is now falling into the atmosphere with nothing but a thin hatch between his face and the fire, hanging forward against his straps, watching it happen. And it gets worse. The heat builds. The hatch in front of him starts to bulge inward from the pressure and the temperature. The rubber seals around that hatch begin to smolder, and then to burn, and the cabin starts filling with acrid smoke from his own spacecraft cooking around him. He is, by every reasonable measure, a dead man. There is no version of the physics as he understands it in that moment where the hatch holds. And here is the detail that I cannot get out of my head. Volynov, believing he was about to die, took his flight logbook, the record of the mission, and he tore out the pages, and he folded them, and he tucked them deep into the middle of his clothing, close to his body. Why? Because he wanted the record to survive the crash, even if he didn't. He wanted the investigators who found the wreckage to be able to read what had happened, so the next crew might live. That is the calmest, bravest, most heartbreaking thing I think I've ever heard from inside a spacecraft. A man preserving the black box with his own body because he's certain the black box is going to outlast him. Then, the universe blinked. The struts holding that stuck service module finally burned and stressed through, and it broke away. And the moment it did, the capsule swung back around the right way, heat shield forward, the way it always should have been. He was going to make it through the fire after all. And then the parachute worked, mostly, but the soft landing rockets that are supposed to cushion the final touchdown failed. So after everything, after the nose-first reentry, after the burning seals, after tucking his logbook against his ribs to survive him, Boris Volynov hit the ground so hard he was thrown across the cabin, and it broke several of his teeth. He got up. He walked. He flew in space again, years later. He preserved the record of his own death, and then declined to die. And the Soviets kept the whole thing quiet for years, because that was the era, and because a man surviving the unsurvivable is not the story a superpower wants to tell about its rockets. But it happened, and Boris Volynov, I think, is one of the toughest human beings who has ever lived. Number 1. STS-1. 07, Columbia, and the decision not to tell them. We end here because this is the one where all the threads of this whole list tie together into a single knot, and it is the heaviest one, so I'm not going to dress it up. January 16th, 2003. The Space Shuttle Columbia launches with 7 people aboard. Rick Husband, William McCool, Michael Anderson, Kalpana Chawla, David Brown, Laurel Clark, and Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, carrying with him the weight of an entire nation watching. 7 people, a good crew, a science mission, a normal launch. 82 seconds after liftoff, a chunk of foam insulation about the size of a suitcase breaks off the big external fuel tank and strikes the leading edge of the left wing. On the ground, this gets caught in the launch footage. And here's where the whole story turns, and where every theme of this list, the false alarm they didn't explain to Glenn, the damage they waved off on Atlantis, the fire they didn't tell the public about on Columbia's earlier flight, comes back with the worst possible outcome. Engineers on the ground saw that foam strike, and some of them were worried. Really worried. Worried enough that they wanted to get pictures of the wing while Columbia was in orbit, to point the powerful cameras that this country has, the ones that can image a spacecraft from the ground or from other satellites at that wing, and actually see whether it was damaged. They asked for it, more than once. Those requests went up through the wrong channels, got tangled in bureaucracy, and were, in the end, turned down. One request actually reached the Department of Defense, who could have taken the images, and it was canceled about 90 minutes later. And why? Read the accident board's findings, and you'll come to a sentence that is hard to sit with. Part of the reasoning for not looking harder was that managers felt there was little that could be done, even if there was damage. Think about that logic. We won't look to see if they're in danger, because if they are in danger, we couldn't help them anyway. It's a silence that guarantees its own ending. If you decide in advance that nothing can be done, then, of course, you never find the thing you might have done. Meanwhile, up in orbit, the crew was told about the foam strike in a brief message and told there was, and this is the phrase, absolutely no concern for entry. Don't worry about it. We've seen foam come off before. Go back to your experiments. And they did. They spent 16 good days in space doing their work, and they came home on February 1st, 2003, believing they were safe. The damaged wing failed during reentry. Superheated gas got inside it, and Columbia came apart in the sky over Texas, and all 7 of them were lost in the last 16 minutes of a 16-day flight within sight of home, now people have argued ever since about whether anything could actually have been done, whether another shuttle could have been rushed up to rescue them, whether they could have patched the wing. The honest answer is that it would have been desperate and difficult and maybe impossible. But that is not really the horror of it. The horror is that the question was never seriously asked, because the people who could have asked it had already quietly decided it wasn't worth the trouble to look. And that's the thread through this entire list, isn't it? 12 emergencies. Some were bad luck, bent pins, and loose solder and valves that failed at the worst moment. But so many of them share the same quieter, more human failure underneath. The gap between what the people up there were facing and what the people down here were willing to say out loud. Glenn, watching fire go by, not told why. Grissom, blamed for the ocean nearly killing him. The Atlantis crew, staring at their wounded ship, told it was a trick of the light. And 7 people on Columbia told there was absolutely no concern, while the concern sat in an inbox on the ground. We send human beings into the most hostile environment there is, sealed and fragile machines, and we ask them to trust us completely, to trust that if something is wrong, we will tell them, and we will move heaven and earth to help. That trust is the real life support system. It's the thing that has to hold. And the most horrifying detail in all of space history isn't a fire or a vacuum or a rocket coming apart. It's the moments when that trust was the thing that failed. Because the void doesn't lie to you. Only we do that. And the least we owe the people we send into the dark is the truth about what's coming for them. Thank you for watching and sticking till the end. We've got plenty more videos coming in the future. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss them. See you in the next one.